Hey guys, so while we don't have a ban list yet, it's still a new format with new decks from Power of the Elements mixing things up a lot, so I'm here to bring another tier list by the data video. And as always, a big thanks to my sponsors. If you're interested in some Dragon Shield sleeves or custom playmats and sleeves from your playmat, links down below. Just going to quickly lay the tier score formula here, but I always refer my audience to my first video so you can learn more about it. Since we didn't have any YCS events yet post POTE, I'm going to use the top cut representation from various regionals the past weekend, at least among lists that were publicly available. A big thanks to Septa360 once again for compiling those topping lists. Alright, so whenever a new deck enters the format, Wadioscope developers probably need some time to be able to properly identify these decks. Now for Spright, Wadioscope can't identify it directly yet, but I did notice a huge upsurge in the use of frogs, which essentially is due to Spright, so I'm going to use that data for this deck. Similarly for Tearlaments, there's an uptick in the use of Shaddolls, which basically is going to be largely driven by Tearlaments since they can use the Shaddol monsters to fuse into Winda. The downside of using Shaddol as a proxy measure for tiers is that they don't always mill Shaddol monsters in a match, so there's a chance that the data for Tearlaments is being a bit underestimated this way. For Branded Despia, this has been something I've brought up all this time, but just decks labeled as only branded will be considered as Branded Despia, but I'm going to reduce its count by 25% because obviously not all branded decks are Despia. Lastly, some other notable decks in the current format such as Exo-Sisters and Evil Twins cannot be identified by Wadioscope at the moment, and there's no other decks that can be used as a proxy measure, so sadly they will not be included for this tier list. So obviously not perfect, but Wadioscope is still amazing for what it can do. So let's get right onto the tier list, and coming in at a very clear number 1 and not even close is Spright. Not only did the deck have by far the most representation among regionals this past weekend, the deck is just killing it online as well with a 61% match win percentage on Dueling Book in the last 7 days. The deck special summons like crazy and makes totally awesome super busted, and it can easily fit 12 to 15 hand traps in the main, so it's not too shabby even if it loses a die roll. Probably won't be tier 0 in TCG, but at the moment I think it's the deck to beat. At a very surprising second was actually Mathmech, which also got a huge boost from Power of the Elements with Mathmech Circular, and it actually had several regional tops this weekend as well. Among all players on Dueling Book, it is performing well too with a 58% match win percentage, and this deck has always been a top rogue contender for a very long time, as you would have seen from my various analytical videos over the past year. Good to see that the deck is finally emerging as a meta contender. Then at number 3 is Punk, which admittedly is hard to categorize since the deck can be combined with so many different engines. Pure Punk has lately become quite popular and their field spell is actually pretty nuts and allows for multiple draws. The Punk archetype in itself was a bit slow to be adapted when first released, but with the release of the Brave engine and Therion, the deck has only been able to move up the meta ladder. Next we have the good old reliable Branded Despia, which has sort of become the old favorite toy at the moment where it used to be so popular, but right now people have moved on to experiment with Spright, Tearlaments, or Punk it seems. Still a strong deck and consistent, which can still make good use of Super Poly this format, although it does suffer from the release of Ultimate Slayer in POTE. Still had several tops in regionals though, so don't ignore them just yet. Starting the tier 2 section is Tearlaments, and as I mentioned, the data for this deck is likely being underestimated because we are relying on Shaddol numbers, and I do think that this deck is tier 1. Also, I'm sure there's more tier decks that topped the regionals the past weekend, but only a couple were actually made publicly available. The deck is very grindy and plays on both turns, and if you thought you hated Winda when Maximus and Schism was a thing, well, we're basically gonna have to relive that now. Next we have Eldritch, which can be played with a variety of different engines such as Branded, Brave, or Punk, and much more. It's actually a pretty strong deck this format, given that the top deck in Spright can lose very hard to Floodgates. The Eldritch Zen effect can be particularly useful in a format with Winda or Dragostapelia lying around all the time among tiers, and it's just the grindiest deck of them all. At third we have Sky Striker, which of course came second place at the North American TCG Championships, piloted by Ryan Yu, although this was before POTE. Now if Gigantic Sprite's effect resolves, then they won't be able to revive Ray that turn, so that might come up, so keep that in mind. Next, a huge drop off is Sword Soul, which in last month's tier list was actually number 1. Still a good deck obviously, but I think part of this has to do with the fact that the best players are probably excited to test new top decks like Spright or Tears right now, so probably fell off. Did not have a good win percentage in the last week at 47% as well, and not as many regional tops with the deck this past weekend. Then we have Floowandereeze, which we can't sleep on because at Toronto regionals that I attended, I know at least 2 people made top 8, but sadly only one of them made their list publicly available, so that was the only one included for the data for this video, just to keep things consistent. It's the best anti-meta deck out there, and I think it's in a good place this format to continue doing well. Lastly, in tier 2 we have Dragon Link, which has just made the tier 1 spot in last month's tier list. The optimal way seems to be with the Brave token engine, and while still very strong, I guess it again was pushed aside with the new top decks emerging. Dragon Link has been one of the most competitively reliable decks for a long time, so it's bound to climb up the ladder again as time passes. Now we move on to Rogue, and Drytron starts us off here, which actually did get at least one regional top. I don't know if turn skip Drytron is the most played version, but heard that's a thing and doesn't sound very fun. Still a very formidable deck, and it's one of those strategies I really get scared being matched up with. Next we have Ad Ignister, which seems to have topped the regional the past weekend, although it was Ignister Math Mech, being at least a rogue deck since it got its buff in Lightning Overdrive, and a rival Ad Ignister was hard to out for many decks leading up to this point, although I guess Spright can just comically run over it with the help of Pixies, and the list typically run Underworld Goddess as well to link it off. Then we have Tri-Brigade, which seems to be picking up play lately, although online the win percentage was pretty miserable at 43%. But it did have at least one top in regionals this past weekend, so it's still a respectable strategy, and Revolt will always be a great card. Next we have a deck that I personally have been playing the last few months, Dogmatic Invoke. Was really in a rough low spot for a while, but I suppose it's climbed up recently. Got more powerful with the release of branded stuff, but sadly has not been anywhere close to its tier 1 form like the old days. The deck may be consistent, but it's sort of consistently subpar in the current format, although I personally play it with a branded Eldritch twist and I love it. Then we have Heroes, a fan favorite deck that at least gets to call DPE its own now. Struggling online with that 44% match win percentage though, and I don't think it's topped the regional this past weekend, at least none that were made publicly available. But do keep in mind that Darklaw's Floodgate effect to banish everything is very strong this format, particularly against tiers, and some players are even playing Mask Change 2 to change their Spright or tier monsters into Darklaw post side. Next we have the good old trusty Salamangreat, which actually has been in the tier 2 spot for the last couple of months, so have dropped for this month. Wasn't able to find any publicly available regional tops for this deck, but let me know if you know it made top 8 somewhere post POTE. Grindy deck that can also OTK and also got a new draw power thanks to Heat Soul. It has been struggling online though it seems with a 44% match win percentage in the last 7 days. Then I hate having to say this each tier list, but we have Mystic Mind Burn. Luckily we're not seeing any regional tops with this deck since I'd be afraid that might motivate some more players to run this, but it is a deck that is rather popular on Dueling Book since it can get a lot of easy scoops since many players just don't want to burn off an hour to go against this deck. Please Konami ban Mystic Mind or at least limit it so that we can at least get the pure burn strategies out of the mix. Lastly, in the Rogue section is Virtual World, which I virtually have not heard of anything from this deck in the last month at least. The Chooch Pop is nice, but in a format where so many players are main decking Dark Ruler, maybe it's not the best, since they typically have something like Crystal Wing and Kaliga, as well as the Griffin from the Brave token, although please correct me if I'm wrong and if that's really outdated. Lastly, in the other section we have Dinos, which has always been in the Rogue section but has fallen off for this month. Sadly, just not a popular deck right now, and whether you're trying to go first or second with this deck, it's just so much harder with Mist Get 1. Maybe Konami can bring Mist to 2 and see if that's fair. Lastly, we have Phantom Knights, which really has fallen off since the ban of Anaconda. Maybe it's best that it stays as a strong roguish contender, since when people titled this as the best deck of the format not that long ago, it really did disappoint and was underwhelming in terms of tournament success. Alright guys, so that was it for this month's tier list by the data post Power of the Elements. Hope you found that interesting. The meta is fresh right now, so that's cool, and let's see if Konami comes down with a ban list to shake things up even further. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrel Lord, Spooky Boogie, and Steven Phillips, as always for supporting the channel. You guys are truly amazing. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, links down below. Take care guys.